you cannot have this narrative that says that trade is great for the poor because of purchasing power. It's also great for the rich. In this paper, we look at whether rich or poor people benefit more from the reduced costs of imported goods. There is a lot of discussions of the role of trade for inequality, and there's work that suggests that low-income people get hurt by trade that creates unemployment for the low-skilled, etc. But there's this other view that the poor also might benefit more from trade because as consumers, they might be the one buying goods from China, say. So there's this idea that maybe the unequal effects on the wage side get offset by unequal effects on the expenditure side. And so what we wanted to do in this paper is actually see to what extent that's true. And so we collected new data of different sorts to answer that question. So the main thing to look at is the consumption baskets of people and who buys imported goods. And so more specifically, what is the share of your spending on imported goods? And so you should think of this as final goods. For example, I import toys from China, but you should also think of this as intermediate inputs. So I buy a bike that uses steel from China. And so the idea is, if I spend $1, £1, €1, how much of this is eventually going to the rest of the world, like outside of my country? Either because I directly buy an imported product or because I buy goods that use imported inputs. So figure 1C looks at this first part of the analysis where we have the data covering the whole US economy. We plot the share of imports and expenditure. So if someone's spending 12% of their expenditure on imports, that's the average in the US economy, or actually they spend 20% or 5%, that's what we want to see. We want to see whether that varies across household income groups. And that's what we plot on the x-axis. And actually you see with this blue line at the top that is actually very flat. So that was much to our surprise at the beginning. There's actually no difference in the intensity of spending on imports across income groups. If a person that has low income spends $1 in the US economy, about 12 cents of that dollar go to the rest of the world. And that's also true if same number, but 12 cents, if you look at someone who makes, say, more than $200,000. So then we look at this in for different subsets of the data. So we look at direct imports, and that's the second line. And so that's also flat. And so that's about like 7 cents. For that dollar you spend, but 7 cents go to the rest of the world for direct imports, like the toys from China. Next line looks at indirect imports, the inputs that you buy that come from the rest of the world, like steel that's used in your bike. Steel is imported from China. That's also flat, about slightly less than 6 cents. And so turns out that direct, indirect import on their own, they're all flat. And then you can look at subsets of partner countries. So if you buy from China, if you buy from high-income countries, if you buy from Mexico and Canada, different types of trading partners, maybe there you have stronger patterns. Turns out it's also not the case. Those are the last 3 lines on the figure. It's also very flat. And so everywhere we looked, that was flat at the beginning. And so then we tried to understand where that came from. So the fact that it's really flat comes from an offsetting effect with 2 parts. The first thing is that richer people buy more services. So because they buy more services are not traded. That makes them less exposed as consumers to international trade. For goods, the rich spend higher expenditure shares, they devote a higher share of the expenditures on products that are very much traded. For example, they buy relatively more consumer electronics, computers and so on, than food, compared to lower income groups, where we'll have larger expenditure shares, relatively speaking, on food and lower on electronics. And in the US, food is not traded very much. Electronics are traded much, much more. And so within goods, the rich are more exposed to international trade, but then they also spend more on services and they're less exposed to international trade. And so that turns out to exactly offset. It's sort of by chance, it didn't have to be, but just turns out it exactly offsets. And so then it creates these very flat patterns, which means that if you reduce tariffs, on average, it's going to benefit consumers to the same extent, regardless of their income, it will increase their purchasing power by the same in percentage terms. We're pretty confident that actually there's not much inequality that's reduced by making poor consumers better off through international trade. That just doesn't happen. People benefit to the same extent. Import shares are very similar across all income groups in the US, which means that there's no impact of trade on inequality through these purchasing power effects.